DRC discussed by the UN Security Council recently, and we'll look at South Africa's role on that Security Council. Also, other US issues, to build a wall or not to build a wall, that is the question that has resulted in a 19-day shutdown of the government of the United States. US President Donald Trump is refusing to sign spending bills to exert pressure on Congress to agree to approve funding for the wall, but the Democrats are holding firm as well. Trump said bye-bye in a tweet and reportedly stormed out of negotiations yesterday. Well, we are delighted to be joined in studio by our US correspondent. He's usually over there. Sherwin Bryce-Pease is here in South Africa in studio for a change to discuss the wall, the UN and other issues. So great to have you with us.
So we can kick each other under the table, Francis.
Indeed, it's fantastic. So the wall saga, I guess, to start with, continues.
Obviously a big electoral issue for President Donald Trump, then campaigning for the presidency. This was kind of what rallied his troops, or his base, if you will. And of course, the promise then was that Mexico would pay for this wall. Of course, reality is now set in. Governing is a different ball game than campaigning. And so a truth has to go through a sieve a little bit more to refine it. And what we are seeing now is that to pay for anything in the United States, you need to procure that through an appropriation or an act of Congress. The difficulty now for President Donald Trump is that Congress is now in the hands, after the midterm elections of November of last year, is now in the hands of the Democrats. Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. There's a new sheriff in town. You have divided government. So the promise of Mexico paying for the wall, no one really believed that. So now the reality is setting in, and he needs Democrats basically to appropriate the funds, the $5.6 billion that he requires for the first tranche or first phase of this wall. And that is now proving to be an uphill battle for this president.
So how is this impasse resolved? Because there's talk that he may declare a national emergency.
Right, so a national emergency would allow the president to procure money that has been already allocated to other departments. For example, the military, they passed a huge spending military bill in excess of $600 billion. So as the argument goes, if there's a national emergency, $5.6 billion could be procured from that military budget. There's a debate as to whether that would be legal if, in fact, this humanitarian crisis, people fleeing abuse in their own countries, human rights violations, if you look at countries like Guatemala and Honduras as just two examples, this is a humanitarian crisis. This is not necessarily a national emergency for the United States. There's a big debate, certainly within the government right now. I mean, you hear figures out of the White House that some 4,000 suspected terrorists have been apprehended at the border. Their own State Department says only 4 have been apprehended with links to terrorism. So there's clearly an attempt by this administration to create a crisis, but the Democrats have been very clear. Nancy Pelosi has been very clear on this. They're not falling for this. They do not believe that the president can replace facts with fear.
Let's listen to what the president said, because the morality around the wall is interesting as well. But let's hear his strong affirmation that it's needed.
My administration has presented Congress with a detailed proposal to secure the border and stop the criminal gangs, drug smugglers, and human traffickers. It's a tremendous problem. Our proposal was developed by law enforcement professionals and border agents at the Department of Homeland Security. These are the resources they have requested to properly perform their mission and keep America safe. In fact, safer than ever before. The proposal from Homeland Security includes cutting-edge technology for detecting drugs, weapons, illegal contraband, and many other things. We have requested more agents, immigration judges, and bed space to process the sharp rise in unlawful migration fueled by our very strong economy. Our plan also contains an urgent request for humanitarian assistance and medical support. Furthermore, we have asked Congress to close border security loopholes so that illegal immigrant children can be safely and humanely returned back home. Finally, as part of an overall approach to border security, law enforcement professionals have requested $5.7 billion for a physical barrier. At the request of Democrats, it will be a steel barrier rather than a concrete wall. This barrier is absolutely critical to border security. It's also what our professionals at the border want Indeed. This is just common sense.
I mean, Sherwin, for the Democrats, is it that $5.7 billion that's the problem, or the way he's speaking about Mexicans?
$5.6 billion is not a lot of money in terms of the entire United States economy, right? $5.6 billion is peanuts if you look at it in a broader sense. What you have here are intransigent groups that are represented by intransigent principles right now in the name of Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi. But if you look at the far left and the far right in the United States, the far left does not want this wall. They do not want their party to cave in to this president that they believe started this conversation based on erroneous or alternative facts, right? So they don't want Nancy Pelosi to cave. She has said she won't. Donald Trump cannot be seen to cave here because his base, that 40%, that 35 to 40% that has been with this president despite everything, and we can get into everything, but I think you know what I mean. He is playing to that base. And so that this is a political discussion. This is not a legislative discussion anymore. This is about who's going to bend the knee first. And I don't think you're going to see that from either party. What we are now hearing is that if he were to declare this national emergency, both parties then can walk away from those negotiations. The government then will reopen, but they would have both saved face. But whether it's a national emergency or not might be something that the courts would have to weigh in on and make a final determination on.
So they're both standing firm on their stance for their bases. It's about elections.
This is about elections. And remember, every 2 years in the United States, a new election cycle starts. We just concluded the midterm elections in November last year. What's the first thing you saw in January of 2019? Elizabeth Warren, the senior senator of Massachusetts, announced her candidacy, or certainly that she was starting an exploratory committee to look at this process. And you're going to hear now more Democrats jumping into this race. So we're in election season. 2020 is very big on the cards. The only question is, what will Robert Mueller have to do about it?
Well, that's the overall thing. I mean, since you've been following Donald Trump, because you've been following him from the beginning.
It's not a matter of choice. I mean, he kind of jumps right in front of you every day, doesn't he?
He's there.
Yeah, he's right in front of you.
Whether you like it or not. But we've been watching the commentary. It's interesting to watch American television, and often there are claims, this is the end for Donald Trump. This is the issue that is going to break his presidency, but the end never comes. So you're talking about Mueller.
Well, an impeachment process is if an impeachment process were to begin, that in itself would be a long process. There is a special counsel investigating with a very broad mandate to look at pretty much everything that happened during that campaign and where the tentacles perhaps might lead. The Mueller report is going to be the definitive moment, but don't forget that there have been other moments. There has been a national security advisor that's been caught in his web that had to resign due to lying about Russian contacts. There is a personal attorney and fixer named Michael Cohen that has just been convicted, I think, of 36 months in prison for violating campaign finance laws, and in his testimony under the instruction of President Donald Trump. Remember the name Stormy Daniels? There was another playmate. They'd made illegal payments. This is seen as a violation of campaign finance laws. The president is implicated in that. The question is and this is a legal question, and I'm not a legal guru, the question is, can a sitting United States president be indicted while in office? That's a debate that politicians and legal scholars are having right now. Some say no. His supporters say no. Democrats are like, we'd like to see him frog march out of the White House with handcuffs. That might not happen. The impeachment process will be determined by the Mueller report, right? And then Congress will have to act. The Senate then acts as a jury. So to impeach a president, the House of Representatives starts the process. They vote through a simple majority. Democrats have that. And then the trial happens in the Senate. And if you remember what happened to Bill Clinton in the 90s, he was impeached, but he was not convicted by the Senate. And to convict, you need 2/3. And Democrats don't have those numbers in the Senate.
And like you say, a long process. So you will be covering Donald Trump for a while for us.
Something like that.
So let's move to South Africa. We're running out of time. On the UN Security Council, it claims that we sided with China and Russia in this whole DRC debate. Of course, there has been discussions. Does it look like already so early we're on the wrong side, or is that going too far?
I use this example when I'm asked this question. In the last Security Council tenure, South Africa sided with the West when they voted for the no-fly zone resolution 1973 that created this no-fly zone over Libya that eventually led to the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi. Russia and China abstained in that vote. So I think if history is our guide, we can't really speculate as to whether South Africa. I've asked the ambassador this: are you going to vote with BRICS? Are you just going to vote sort of in sort sort of your local or national interests. He says, no, I mean, we are not just a representative of BRICS or SADC or our national interests as South Africa. We have a responsibility to look at what's in the greater good for the entire the world, whether you're in Vietnam, Malawi, I think with some of the examples he used. So I think in this instance, South Africa was very clear on what they wanted to see. The West wanted condemnation from the Council before the Electoral Commission in the DRC had pronounced. South Africa said, hang on a bit, let the national process unfold, let the institutions pronounce on this before we take any action. Yeah. So no, I don't think it is definitive of how they will vote in the future, no.
All right, so this will be so important for South Africa's foreign policy. We'll see how those votes go in the UN Security Council. We are running out of time. R. Kelly, that's blowing up in the States. It seems like old claims, a documentary comes out. Is this really blowing up around him?
It is blowing up. I think it's blowing up. I've been in South Africa the last 3 weeks, and it's been blowing up here. And if you just look at some of the reports in the United States, this is a big talking point right now, despite Donald Trump hoping that people will be focused on his wall. I think there's a lot of scrutiny now being placed. We understand that law enforcement, prosecutors in different states, I believe Chicago and Atlanta, so you're talking about Illinois and into the south in Georgia, taking a new look at this. And remember, there are a number of claims made in a documentary. What you now require is for an investigation to happen, for testimony, for affidavits to be produced, for a legal process to unfold. Speaking in the documentary is not reporting a crime to the police. So we have to see these witnesses now, go and report these crimes, witness statements taken, and then investigations need to happen. I think if you look at Harvey Weinstein and all these other Me Too moments, there's a court process that now needs, a legal process that needs to unfold. The documentary in itself is an indictment. It's whether this will stand up in court is the question.
Let's end with this. So you're closer to it. We're watching a lot of these movements, Me Too, the movements against racial killings, cops involved, and then also looking at the supporters of the Blues. How would you describe race relations, gender relations in America? It feels like there's a lot of flux.
There's a lot going on in the United States, right? I think and it depends also, because it's such a big country, remember there are 50 states and people tend to focus on what's going on in New York or Miami or LA or Chicago. But there's Kentucky and there's Indiana and there are all these smaller rural states where things are very different. If you look at the electoral map in the United States, it tends to be blue on both coasts and red in the middle. There is certainly a conflict of ideas. There is a fight for the soul of the United States. I think Donald Trump represents an element of that. And I think what we witnessed in the midterm elections was perhaps the antithesis to that becoming the dominant narrative. Yes, race relations are better than they were in the 1960s. But black people are still being shot by the police.
Yeah. Well, keep your finger on the pulse for us. Thank you. Great to have you with us. For a change in studio, that was South Africa, SABC's US foreign correspondent, Sherwin Bryce.